Hey guys, I love y'all. I miss y'all. I hope that this message will be an encouragement to you today. So let's get started. I want us to start by reading a quote from Mother Teresa to get us thinking about our teaching for today. So it goes like this. She said, "The greatest disease in the West today is not tuberculosis or leprosy. It is being unwanted, unloved, and uncared for." We can cure physical diseases with medicine, but the only cure for loneliness, despair, and hopelessness is love. There are many in the world who are dying for a piece of bread, but there are many more dying for a little love. The poverty in the West is a different kind of poverty. It is not only a poverty of loneliness, but also of spirituality. There is a hunger for love as there is a hunger for God. And that's by Mother Teresa. So today we're going to be talking about loneliness. Research says that despite all of the technology that we have to connect us, that there is actually an epidemic not just of coronavirus in our culture, but also of loneliness. But before we go too far, I want to make a clear distinction between being alone and being lonely. So, for example, right now, I am totally alone. I am completely isolated except for my dog. Like, my parents came into town the first weekend of social distancing, but otherwise, I have not had physical contact, like not a hug, not a fist bump, nothing, in like 3 weeks. And by the time this is all said and done, I will not have like touched another human being in like 2, 3, 4, 5 months. Let's hope it's not 5 months. But I can tell you, I am for sure alone. I'm alone. But I am not lonely. Not at all. And if that's something you're worried about, I'm good. I'm not at all lonely. But I want us to talk about loneliness. Loneliness is a feeling that your situation, your experience, your life is not understood, valued, or connected with other people. What's really interesting about loneliness is that sometimes we experience loneliness the most intensely when we are surrounded by other people. For example, you can end up feeling really alone if you're the only person that doesn't go along with what everybody else is doing. Or you could be at school with literally thousands of people. Remember those days? Going to school? You could be at school with thousands of people, but let's say your friend group shifted and you get left on the outs. So there you are surrounded by people, but that's pretty lonely. Or for my seniors, many of you are going to be out on your own for the first time in a couple months. And those first few weeks being far away from your homies and your family, that can feel pretty lonely. Or maybe at home right now, you're going through something and you're surrounded by your family literally all the time, but you feel incredibly lonely because the thing that you're going through, you feel like they wouldn't understand and you feel like nobody would understand. You see, the thing about loneliness is that feeling that our battles are our own and that in them we have no allies, no backup, no one on our side, no one that cares. And times like these can feed into that feeling. We can find ourselves thinking about who we haven't heard from, who hasn't reached out, and that can reinforce the feelings of loneliness that we have. In fact, when it comes to loneliness, our generation is flooded with it. More than half of Americans say that they feel lonely often. And that sense of loneliness is contributing to a rise in other things like anxiety, self-harm, depression, suicide, because loneliness tends to make us feel hopeless. You see, we all have a deep desire for connection. Yes, you, introverts. Yes, you too. We all want to be known and loved for who we are. And this is how God wired us. God wired us for close, connected relationships. And that's why loneliness is so challenging, because we're wired to be deeply connected to other people. You and I were never meant to carry the weight of our lives, the weight of our feelings, and our experiences, and our stressors on our own. We were meant to do life in community, to share our burdens with others, and for us to bear the burdens of others. And so it makes sense that when we don't feel like we have those relationships, that when we don't have deep connected bonds with other people, the bonds that we were created for, that's why that feeling of loneliness is so hard. And so then that begs the question, well, then what do we do about it? So in a really practical sense, you want to start by taking proactive, intentional steps to invest in your relationships. And this is a pretty optimal time to do that. What many of us have more of right now is time. However, having a close relationship doesn't mean that you just check in. It means that you open up and that you trust other people with things that matter to you. And it also means that you become a person that other people can trust with the things that matter to them, and that you become a person that people can open up to. And this process, it takes time, and it's the process of building trust. And that process of building trust in a relationship is in little doses, little bit after a little bit after a little bit. So that takes time to do, but fortunately what we have right now is time. So I encourage you, while we're under quarantine, to stretch yourself by deepening your relationships. However, there are times when we have those connected relationships, but we still feel very lonely, like no one understands what we're going through. And that's what I want us to talk about today. So we're going to learn today from the experience of Jesus's disciples. Now, just as a reminder, for years they had been traveling together, doing life and learning from Jesus. And they had walked away from the life that they had previously known. They had walked away from their jobs, from their family members, from their secure finances, from safety in general, to take this risk to follow Jesus. And so they'd kind of put all of their hope, all of their stake in him. And then he dies on the cross, and all of a sudden, they're on their own. And you have to remember that we have more information on the backside about the resurrection. But for them, in that moment, in those days between when Jesus died and his resurrection, as far as they know, that's it. He's just gone. And we don't spend a lot of time talking about those days between Jesus's death and his resurrection, but I think it's really important not to skip past those days, because for Jesus's followers, I want us to just really embrace what that must have felt like for them, because they had put all of their hope in him, and as far as they know, he's gone. And the future and the hope that they had imagined in him and for themselves died right along with him. Just like that, everything changes. And so I just want you to imagine what that was like for them, to have taken such a risk to put their hope in Jesus, and then he's dead. He's gone. 1 minute, you are literally walking with God himself in human form. And I can't imagine how loved and known they must have felt to have walked with Jesus in person, but the next minute, he's dead and gone, and you have no plan, no hope. That has to be a crippling feeling of loneliness. They must have been disoriented and felt defeated. And so trying to learn from them of okay, well, how do you go on from that? Well, some of them stuck together, but many of them just ran for their lives and hid from the people who had killed Jesus, because they have no clue what's going to happen next. We know how the story ends, but at the time, they don't know that. So imagine their surprise and their relief at seeing Jesus again when he's resurrected. But what we know is that Jesus, after he's resurrected, he's going to leave again. You see, he died, he comes back to life at the resurrection, and then he leaves again. John, one of Jesus' disciples, records in his gospel that before Jesus was crucified, he told his disciples that he was going to go away. But they didn't fully understand or appreciate what he was talking about at that time. How could they? This is what he had said in the final meal with his disciples before he was arrested. This is in John chapter 16, verse 7. It begins, Jesus says, "But in fact, it is best for you that I go away." So Jesus actually tells his disciples that it would be best for them if he goes away, if he leaves. And so if I'm then, I'm thinking, yeah, there's no way that's better for us. But listen to how the verse continues. It says, "It would be best for you if I go away, because if I don't, the advocate won't come. If I do go away, then I will send him to you." So Jesus says that in order for the advocate to come, he had to go. Now, the term advocate usually refers to someone who helps and comforts and defends others. And the same is true here. This advocate that Jesus is referring to is what we call the Holy Spirit. And the Holy Spirit is basically the Spirit of Jesus that is among us, even though Jesus is not physically present anymore. He is the one, the advocate, is the one who helps us and comforts us and gives us wisdom and power that goes beyond ourselves. The Holy Spirit came to earth after Jesus left earth. Jesus promised that if he left, that it would be better for us. And so I want us to think about, okay, why is that better for us? Because the Holy Spirit would be here. And when the Holy Spirit arrived, the power and the Spirit of Jesus could be everywhere, not just limited to the person of Jesus Christ, but the Holy Spirit is everywhere. And so right before Jesus ascends into heaven and leaves for the second time, he reminds his disciples of what he said at their last meal together before he was killed. Yes, his physical body is leaving, but his spirit would remain behind. I want you to listen to what he says. He says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere, in Jerusalem, throughout Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." Of all of the things that Jesus could have reminded his disciples, he chose to remind them that the Holy Spirit was coming upon them, that the Holy Spirit would come and give them power to tell people all over the world about him. In other words, it was a reminder that even though he was leaving, that they weren't alone, that his Spirit was still with them. And that's really important because in the days and in the years to come, Jesus' followers would receive the power of the Holy Spirit to tell people all over the world about him. The men and the women who Jesus left twice, once physically and then once again after the resurrection, started the greatest movement in human history. Even when their leader, Jesus, had left, even with their overwhelming lack of resources, even with their perceived powerlessness in the face of the authorities of that day, the Holy Spirit gives them power, even though it seems that they are powerless. Even though Jesus has left, he sends the Holy Spirit to be with them. And that means even though Jesus isn't physically there, that they would never be alone. Now, Jesus' promise is not just for his first disciples. When Jesus promised an advocate who would give us power and be with us, that's true for everyone who would ever follow him. And that means you and I have access to the same Spirit, that the Holy Spirit abides in us. What Jesus promises us is that we are never alone, even when we feel alone. Just like it might feel like no one is with us, Jesus says someone is with us. The Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, is with us all the time. You see, Easter is much bigger than a celebration of something that happened a long time ago. Yes, Jesus' resurrection changed everything, and the resurrection is the center of everything that we believe as Christians. But we can tend to think about celebrating Easter as celebrating something that God has done, something in the past, like, oh yeah, this is amazing, this thing that God did way back then. But it's important to remember that after Jesus' resurrection, we receive the Holy Spirit, and that the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, is at work in you right now. That the Holy Spirit is moving in our world right now. Jesus' first followers knew what it was like to feel like they were totally on their own. After he died, it would have seemed like all of their hopes had been crushed. And they may have even felt like they had made a huge mistake in following him. And while I can imagine that they loved seeing him come back to life, they were probably surprised when he didn't stay. They probably wondered, how is this going to work if Jesus is not physically with us? How can that possibly be a good thing? But soon they learned that it was, because he had left something behind. He had left the Holy Spirit behind. His Spirit reminds them that they are not alone. And so I want us to think about what this means for us today. What if you and I could live with the same assurance and the same confidence that they did after receiving the Holy Spirit? What if no matter how lonely or overwhelmed or misunderstood we felt, if we knew deep in our core that we were never alone? I want to ask you really directly, what if this is real? I believe that it is. What if the literal, actual God who created everything and died and rose again is literally always with you? What if the Holy Spirit and the Spirit of Jesus is very real, very here, very in our midst, and wants to help you and speak love and truth into every single thing that you are facing today? What if our world, which is experiencing a crisis of loneliness, knew that the very Spirit of God is right here? That it is always with us. You see, simply trusting the Holy Spirit is what can change everything for us. In fact, even though we can't see him, even though we might not always feel his presence, we might not feel like he's there, knowing that he is with us in moments where we feel like we're on our own means that we can have confidence in a couple of things. First, that you can talk to him and confide in him anytime, any place, for any reason. Which means the thing that you're struggling with right now, the thing that's on your heart right now, talk to him about it. He's right there, right in your midst, listening to you. That when you feel alone, if you choose to talk to God about what you're going through, think about how comforting that is to know that you're not alone, that God is right there with you, and that he hears what you're going through. In the New Testament, we learn that the Holy Spirit helps us talk to God when we don't know what to say. What if the next time you felt like you were on your own, you chose to talk to God about what you're facing, what you're feeling? What would happen if you chose to believe that he hears you and that his Spirit is at work in ways that you can't even see? The other thing that we can have confidence in is that there is more going on than what appears to be. You see, the odds were stacked against Jesus' first followers. Jesus wasn't there. They were underqualified. The Romans were incredibly powerful. We know what the facts would say. They didn't stand a chance. Yet, the movement that they carried forward has changed our world forever. And that's because that they knew that they were stronger than they seemed. They knew that even though it looked like the cards were stacked against them, that they were not on their own, that they had God's power flowing in them and through their lives. And the same is true for you and I. When we are up against challenges in our own lives, if you're like me, you tend to want to do the math and kind of evaluate the circumstances and say, okay, well, I know how this is going to play out. And you might feel like you've done the math, you've assessed the situation, and that there's no hope. What we have to keep in mind is that the Holy Spirit is at work in our lives, and that His power is always moving in our life. And so therefore, we don't know how everything's going to play out. The power of Easter is that Jesus enabled us to be confident that we will never be alone again. Why? Because we trust His Spirit. We trust that His Spirit lives inside us and that His Spirit is at work in our world. And in a day and age where so many of us are lonely, this might be the best news that we have heard in a while. I want you to think about this question. In what area of your life do you feel alone? And then I want you to imagine Jesus, the same Jesus who loves you, who died for you, looking you in the eyes and saying, you are not on your own. We're in this together. That's probably the best news that we could hear this week. And you don't have to imagine this. This is the way things are. This is true. The Holy Spirit makes it a reality. This is why Easter is so very, very happy.